Welcome, everybody. I am happy to be the MC for panel number 5, BIF, Film Criticism and Transnationality. My name is Marcus Nornes, and I teach Asian film at the University of Michigan. Most of my work is on Japanese film, but I also work on South Korea and Chinese language cinema, and most particularly on documentary and film festivals. When it comes to Korea, I've mainly done a little bit on documentary, and then I had the pleasure of editing Hallyu 2.0 with Sangjoon. I want to warn you that I had Moderna #2 last night, and it broke my brain. So I'm going to do my absolute best to keep my brain under control. So, and MC here, I am really happy to introduce you to our 2 panelists. It's a slightly shorter panel. The second panelist, actually, I'll start with Simon. Simon Chung is from Singapore National University and will be presenting on Busan International Film Festival, BIF, and the city. And I'll come back between papers and give you, Simon, a proper introduction. And the first paper is by Andrew Jackson from Monash University. And he has a paper with a long title, Festival or Box Office: The Critical Reception of Spring in My Hometown and the Debate Over the Future Direction of South Korean Cinema 1998 to 1999. I must be getting better if I was able to read that fast. So I want to introduce you a little bit to Andrew and his work. He's an associate professor at Monash and a historian of great breadth of Korean studies. He got his PhD at SOAS in Korean history, and that was about 10 years ago. And then his research interests right now are centered on art houses and cinephilia in 1990s South Korea, although he's looking at Tokyo at least, maybe other parts of Asia. It's a very great topic. He's also written and writing about North and South Korean film and about the Korean War. He's the author of the 1728 Musin Rebellion, Politics and Plotting in 18th Century Korea, which came out from Hawaii in 2016. And he's the co-editor with Colette Balmain of Korean Screen Cultures, Interrogating Cinema, TV, Music, and Online Games from Peter Lang in the same year. He's also one of the founders of the Korean Screen Culture Conference, which brings people together to present on film, TV, pop music, videos, online gaming. It's going strong in its 10th year. So without any further ado, please welcome Andrew David Jackson.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for that introduction. I'm very sorry to give you such a long title to read there. You did a very good job considering everything you're going through with this the vaccination. And thank you very much also to Evan and Sangjoon and Professor Yong and everybody who have organized this conference and invited me along today. What I'm going to be doing today is rewinding from the current period of the global success of South Korean film and 10 million domestic admissions and 50% market share and festival successes of films like Parasite, rewind to 1998, 1999, a time when, as you will know, South Korean cinema was in a very different position. The days when domestic film accounted for 20% or less of the market share was still fresh in people's minds, and there were still angry demonstrations against the reduction of the screen quota, and there was still a lot of quite a lot of uncertainty about the future direction of South Korean film. And I'm really interested in this period, the 90s, especially as Marcus said earlier, in terms of art houses in this period, but also in this period because it was such a perhaps a key period in this transformation of South Korean film and the cinematic industry. You can see this in domestic film, doubled in that year, 1999, to 40%, with the release of lots of films, notable films like Shiri, the film that's kind of remembered, I guess, for helping to plot the future course of South Korean film. And what I'm interested in here is really a historical question. And at this very moment when the tectonic plates of South Korean cinema were shifting, what were some of those people who were closest to the industry, those critics and scholars, what did some of these people, how did they view the kind of films that were coming out? How did they view the state of the industry in this period and the challenges that it faced? And what did they see as the best way forward for the industry? So this is what I'm looking at today. And I answer this question by analyzing critical responses to a single film. This film in this period shared the limelight, some of the limelight in 1998 and 1999, along with Shiri. And the film is Spring in My Hometown by director Lee Kwang-mo, who's also well known as an art film distributor and art house exhibitor, art film exhibitor. And what I noticed about a lot of these articles that appeared in magazines like Cine 21, Premiere, Performing Arts and Film Review, Film News and Kino, is that most of them went beyond a discussion of this film, Spring in My Hometown, and actually the articles were more sort of meditation on the state and the future of South Korean filmmaking in general. So these critical voices really sort of clearly saw in Spring in My Hometown something very valuable and very important at this moment. It's not seen so by historians and film scholars nowadays so much, but in this moment, critics really sort of saw something in this film that they thought paved a potential direction for South Korean film. Now, these commentaries on Spring in My Hometown and also the state of the industry in this period, they don't offer a sort of complete picture, but a kind of snapshot into the types of debates that were going on within the media and within academia about South Korean film industry that was on the cusp of this transformation, but not quite changed yet. So what I'm going to do today is very briefly discuss the conclusions of three of these critics about two areas in particular. One is the possible way forward for the South Korean film industry, and the second one is the issues and challenges that faced Junhyoung at this time. And finally, I'm going to conclude by sort of discussing why it's important for us to understand these critical voices and why it's important today to consider them. And the first thing you notice about a lot of these articles is, well, the first thing is there's no real unified opinion about the best direction for South Korean cinema at this juncture. Some critics like Chon Chan-il, writing in Screen in December 1998, argued that Junhyoung, or the established sort of South Korean film industry, was going in completely the wrong direction. And instead of targeting popular commercial films, genre film, South Korean film directors should target international film festivals. And he was referring mainly to the success of three films, one, Spring in My Hometown, but also The Power of Gangwon Province and Christmas in August. The success of these three films in Cannes Film Festival. And he says that this was the first time that three South Korean films had attracted such attention at the preeminent sort of World Film Festival. And all of these films were praised by audiences and critics and judges and juries and all the rest of it for their innovative style and their editing, their mise en scène, and so on. And by way of example, if you haven't seen the film Spring in My Hometown, this film consists of 120 single shot scenes filmed mainly in long shot, deep focus, long take, with only a handful of close-ups. And the style and subject matter of films like Spring in My Hometown, So Christmas in August, and The Power of Gangwon Province really captured the imagination of these festival juries at this and audiences at this time at Cannes. And one critic described this as a renaissance of South Korean film. Most significant of all for Chon, all of these films were made by debut directors who were innovating and risk-taking and creating formally challenging films on quite difficult subjects. So for him, the only way forward for South Korean film industry in this period, and the only way it could flourish in the future in an increasingly sort of competitive commercial market, well, international market, was for directors to follow their lead and to make this kind of film. Now, not all critics writing in these magazines thought that Hong Sang-soo, Ho Jin-ho and Lee Kwang-mo were represented the best way forward for South Korean film. Other critics like Kwak Kyung-jin, writing in December 1998 in the Performing Arts and Film Review, were extremely critical of these types of films, especially Spring in My Hometown, with what he claims was, on one hand, a very sort of stunningly beautiful film and cinematography, but on the other hand, it dealt in an unsatisfactory way, he argues, with the horrific subject matter, featuring the defilement of Korean women by American soldiers during the Korean War. And he argues that this type of film was really designed to cater for the scopophilia and Orientalist views of foreign festival-going audiences. And his article was extremely critical of films like Spring in My Hometown. And his article is also a kind of call for a return to more politically progressive films of the 1990s, independent style films, he argues. And then finally, the third critic I'm going to discuss is Shim Young-suk. And her work appeared in November 1999 in a edition of Literature and Society. And she argued that there was a place for films like Spring in My Hometown in this future South Korean film industry, but this had to be in a much more balanced South Korean film industry, she argues. And she says in her article, what's very interesting is a choice of language. She says that South Korean film is standing at this crossroads, a very important crossroads, and it's thinking about which way, the direction it should go in. Should it go the sort of Taiwanese route towards film festival, or should it target something else? Should it go towards a more sort of commercial direction? And she uses Shiri as an example. So she said, on one hand, you have films like Shiri that were kind of a blueprint for commercial production and distribution. But on the other hand, you had what she calls masterpiece cinema. And she gives the example of Spring in My Hometown, but also Nowhere to Hide and Peppermint Candy. These are the examples of, and The Power of Gangwon Province. These are examples of these masterpiece cinemas. And she argues that the criteria for an industry can't just be commercial success, but that masterpiece films would also bring a lot of attention to the industry and be successful in international film festivals and provide a critical balance in a lopsided industry that's far too weighted towards the commercial side and favoring shitty type big budget blockbusters. And what's really interesting about all of these articles is the manner in which they describe the established sort of cinematic industry, Chungmuro. And this is very interesting use of language, especially Shim. She peppers her article with lots of sickness and bodily metaphors. She talks about curing deformed, and this is her word, deformed industry, providing an antidote and taking the pulse of the industry and providing this antidote that's so necessary to cure it of its sickness. And it's very sort of interesting language in light of the pandemic, global pandemic that's going on now. But she discusses the industry in these types of terms, and she's particularly contemptuous of Chungmuro, which she says has a sagging and calloused backside. Sagging and calloused because it had been sitting in exactly the same position and producing the same formulaic types of films for many, many years. So the critics viewed the industry as something that was sick and required the newness of cinema offered by Hong Sang-soo, Lee Chang-dong, Lee Myung-se, Spring in My Hometown, and also by Shiri, if it was to survive in the future. And another very interesting criticism that was identified by these journalists and scholars was for one particular ailment of the industry in the period, and that was a lack of, what they said was a lack of technical know-how, and this is quite interesting, and technological development. And one specific area of interest for the authors was the struggles of some of these directors to get their films made, especially Lee Chang-dong when he was completing Spring in My Hometown. And he spent almost 9 months in post-production at a time when most films were completing post-production in just a couple of months. And one reason for this length of time, according to these articles, were the technical problems that Lee faced when he was completing his film in South Korea. Now, on one hand, Lee couldn't find a lot of the equipment he needed to synchronize the sound in the way that he wanted for his film. And he also struggled to make the titles, the credits, the subtitles and intertitles that he uses in this film. He struggled to get these produced in South Korea. And in the end, sorry, man, I'm going to be late for that. He ended up giving up and sending his, completing a lot of his post-production in Japan. And also the editing studios in Seoul ended up scratching the original tape of the film. So it was almost lost forever. And in the end, it had to be fixed in Tokyo, in Magica and Sony Studios. So the film was actually completed in Tokyo. And that was how we ended up seeing the film. So the critics are very drawn to these complaints of Lee and to what they perceived as this innovative sort of filmmaking techniques of people like Lee, of directors like Lee, and the other thing is, you have to remember that this was a man who'd never made a film before. I mean, this was his graduation, his MA graduation film from UCLA. And this also drew the critics who were very interested in this fact. And they thought, well, look, they argued, well, look, this is, if we can get somebody who's kind of unsullied by the Chungmuro system, if we can get someone who's untarnished by these problems that have been inherited, then somebody like Lee and these other directors could bring in fresh ideas and energy to an industry that was virtually seen as moribund by these critics. And they also discuss at length a lot of these innovative techniques from these directors, especially Lee. For example, Lee invited the crew, for example, to contribute to the completion of the script. So during filmmaking, Lee would have a filmed dress rehearsal, and he would then invite the crew to comment on the script and to update it and to get rid of bits that they didn't think were realistic. So this was quite an innovative technique at this stage, before scripts, according to these articles, had been the South Korean filmmaking process was very top down. The director was a big boss and everyone followed his orders, and scripts came fully finished. So the crew had no sort of opportunity to take part, and they were unused to this level of consultation. So these innovations are also another focus of these articles. Now, I'm going to sort of start sort of concluding a little bit here, but some of the things, and these are kind of tentative conclusions, I haven't completely finished this work, but contrary to what I'd expected in these discussions of films in 1998 and 1999, given some of the demonstrations that were going on. There's no mention of screen quotas and greater governmental sort of intervention into the industry and greater protection against foreign film. And there's not much discussion either of Hollywood as this sort of predatory beast. And this is quite interesting for me. For in all of these articles, these scholars and critics, the sense you get is they really saw the future of South Korean film industry lying very much in its own hands, and the only way it could sort of develop in the future was through this reform and development of young new directors and better investment and so on. And in this way, it could sort of flourish in an age of more intense global competition. So rather than a defensive tone, there's a very positive tone to these articles, and the critics clearly sort of recognize the creativity that was emerging in the cinema at the time. Now, a second point I'd like to sort of conclude on is to talk a little bit about the critics themselves. And the intention of this research is not really to look at it, is really to look at critical discourses as reflective of different voices in academia, in the media and society, rather than focus on these individual critics and their opinions as either right or wrong. You know, this person didn't really predict what was going to happen, and this person did, you know, and therefore they're a bad critic and so on. This wasn't really the aim of what I was trying to do. But it did strike me that of all these critical voices, that one voice in particular, and that's of Shim, she seemed to have the strongest grasp of the importance of this moment as a sort of transformation in South Korean film, and this idea, you know, this sense of this being a sort of the crossroads for South Korean film and the way it could go, and she seemed to have the strongest sense of the different choices that the industry faced. Although she couldn't have predicted the way the industry would go, you know, in terms of directors like Bong Joon-ho and so on, who were able to make sort of to act as sort of commercial auteurs and marry sort of commercial success with a more personal authorial style. But she does identify some of these dilemmas that kind of live on within South Korean film. And these are not issues that have gone away. What she talks about this, when she talks about, you know, putting too much weight and emphasis on commercial industry over independent film and also art film, what she calls masterpiece cinema. It's not really an issue that's ever gone away, and you can see this in the you know, critical discourses today. You can see this in the annual Korean film reports. There's often an article by Kim Yong-jin and scholars like this and critics like this who argue that, you know, there's too much weighting on the commercial side over independent film. So I think this is a really important part of this, what we get from these voices back from the past, from 1998 to 1999. What we also see is, and I guess the reason for this is because of the direction that South Korean cinema has gone in which it's not too weighted. It's not completely, it didn't put all its eggs in one basket, as Chris Berry argues. It didn't go the art film festival route, and it didn't go completely to genre film. It seems to it has a far more diverse, or full service cinema, far more diverse industrial outlook. So look, I think I've gone to 20 minutes, so I'm going to finish right there, so I don't go over time anymore. But thank you very much.
So Simon is one of these rare beasts. It's not a literature scholar, a historian, or a film studies type, but comes out of architecture, which I think is just incredibly awesome. Two of my favorite art forms. And so I'm really looking forward to this. She's the assistant professor at the Department of Architecture National University of Singapore. And she's got both an MPhil and PhD in architecture. Oh, I'm sorry. The PhD is from architecture and the MPhil is in screen media and culture from Cambridge. She has been a practicing architect in Britain. And her research has involved the kinds of synergies that just seem natural between spatial arts like cinema and architecture. And she embeds these in different kinds of theoretical paradigms, from film studies to urban studies. It's really, really pretty amazing. And I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say about Busan International Film Festival. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus, for that generous introduction. Just sharing my screen while we're at it. Okay. Yeah. So good morning to everyone from Singapore. It's about 7:30 a.m. in the morning here. I'd like to first thank the NAM Center for Korean Studies, the organizers of this conference, especially Sangjoon for inviting me to be part of this conference, and to the support team for doing such a wonderful job. So my presentation today is a focus study on the Busan International Film Festival, or BIF, and its host city. And so as an urban scholar and an architect, I will consider this from several spatial scales. I first locate a direct connection between the film festival's strategic role in Busan's urban regeneration and city branding agenda, and the state-driven decentralization to encourage balanced regional development across South Korea. I will also evaluate the spatial attributes of the film festival's name site to appreciate how the city is employed for the construction of a cohesive festival experience. Okay. So just for some background, the BIF was originally an independent film festival conceived by and for cinephiles, and it has matured into Asia's leading film festival. It has run continuously since 1996 and is categorized as a non-competitive feature film festival. It was also in the late 1990s that we saw the rise of cinephilia and globalization in South Korea, which led to the emergence of several themed film festivals, such as Busan and the Women's International Film Festival in Seoul. But BIF's ascendance coincided with the growing global recognition of Korean cinema through the success of Korean directors at prestigious film festivals like Andrew was discussing about earlier on. And it played a key role in introducing Korean cinema to a global audience. And this in particular is due to a retrospective on the Korean New Wave in its inaugural edition that not only periodized this cinema movement in Korean film history, but also identified a definitive body of work. So although South Korea has transitioned from an authoritarian to a developmental neoliberal state, the state continues to steer the trajectory of the domestic film industry. And as we will see, BIF was directly co-opted for specific development goals for Busan. Since its second edition, half of the festival's budget comes from the city government, with institutional support via the Korean Film Council making up 20%, and the remainder from registration fees, ticket sales, and sponsorships. Okay, so just for some context, Busan is the second largest metropolis after Seoul in Korea. Its current position as the biggest port in Northeast Asia actually stretches further back to when Busan was first chosen as the first treaty port for Korea in 1876, when it opened up for international trade. So, and also due to its geographical distance from the state capital, Busan has always been rather proactive in initiating trans-border economic opportunities. Julian Springer notes how film festivals have become a constitutive feature of global cities and how cities now act as nodes in the film festival circuit in the economy of global flows. So this indispensability of physical location also means that film festivals have come to be, as Cindy Wong says here, a celebration of place and the city that hosts them. Okay. So for some facts, attracting around 200,000 visitors, this schedule in autumn contributes to stimulating Busan's tourism industry and economy outside the peak summer season. And actually its dates are adjusted every year so as not to clash with Chuseok, which is one of the most important holidays in Korea. So its international orientation complements two well-loved local events that share the city's autumn calendar: the Jakarta Seafood Festival, you see on the top right, and the Busan Fireworks Festival, that's on the bottom left of this picture. So these are the photos I'm showing here in the slide are actually festivals that managed to fit in at least a couple of times while I was actually attending the BIF. But this streamlining of cultural assets to maximize targeted tourism has been part of the Busan government's cultural tourism promotion goals that's been underway since 2001. Okay. So even though the film festival has been operating from a permanent base at the Busan Cinema Center since 2011, it continues to adopt a multi-site program of events during the festival. And this includes the BIF Square in Nampodong when the festival first began, and BIF Village in Hyundai Beach. I also noted that BIF's gradual transplantation towards the east was coterminous with Busan's urban transformations over the last 3 decades. Just for some background history. So for a long time, Gwangbok-dong, which is the area adjoining Nampodong, has functioned as the city center. And by mid-1990s, the installation of a subway network elevated Seongyeon, in a key transport hub, into another center, while Hyundai begin to emerge as a sub-center. More importantly, the completion of Gwangan Bridge in 2002 for the Asian Games opened up an express route from the Gimhae International Airport on the left, straight towards Hyundai, therefore bypassing the downtown. So what happens is that this effectively led to activating East Busan, but at the same time, leading to an emptying out of the city center. So the 2020 master plan that was released in 2004 revised Busan's planning structure from a single core to a triple hub configuration. And Seongyeon and Junhyoung were subsequently redeveloped as compact cities, and Hyundai district, where Busan Cinema Center and the BIF Village are located, was designated as the new cultural and commercial center for Busan. So going slightly back in time, the 5-year National Balanced Development Plan, which was enacted through a special act in 2004, lists Busan as one of 11 regional cities that were selected by for innovation-led development. So central to Roh Moo-hyun's decentralization and deregulation strategy is the creation of regional innovation clusters across South Korea. And one of its more progressive steps was the relocation of relevant public institutions from the capital to these new clusters. Busan Innovation City leverages on Busan's international locational advantage to pursue multi-sectoral planning in maritime and fisheries, film and media, finance and logistics. So under this banner of Dynamic Busan, a new innovation district was announced in 2005 to develop a film and visual culture hub in Samton City in East Busan. And concurrent with this was the relocation of the Korean Film Council, the Korean Media Rating Board, and the Game Rating and Administration Committee to Busan. So the state was clearly quite cognizant of the BIF's soft capital power beyond Korean shores. The ambition to develop Busan from a film festival host city to a film city with a film industry, however, is a bold move for a city that really had no established or strong film industry past, even with strong central government backing. Because new industries that operate in post-industrial and urban settings typically evolve out of past practices or pre-industrial cultural activities. Now about the innovation hub site itself. Due to Busan's hilly topography and the western part of the city already densely inhabited, the logical recourse would be to redevelop dilapidated urban areas and brownfield land. And the Centum City mega project, where the Innovation District and Busan Cinema Center was to be sited, is one such example. The entire hub was constructed tabula rasa on the site of an important airbase during the Korean War that was subsequently developed into the city's international airport. It was then left untouched for 2 decades before after the airport was decommissioned, and construction on the land for Centum City began in 1997. So in its place, you see now mega malls, cultural venues, agency offices, film and media related production facilities. So where you actually see a great diversity in terms of like retail and entertainment that merges with industry. Now, this development strategy that is centered on the film festival corresponds to an event-themed regeneration. So unlike an event-based regeneration, which is actively adopted for cities that's actually going to be hosting mega events such as the Olympics and World Expo, an event-themed regeneration uses an event within a broader strategy driven by goals that exist over and above the event itself. And parallel initiatives are often bolted on in order to lever wider effects. So the blueprint for Busan's Film and Visual Culture Hub is the consolidation of infrastructure, industry, investment capital, and institution in this 34-hectare site to achieve functional concentration over the long term. So that's kind of like ringed out in the yellow outline. And the cluster concept that was proposed by Michael Porter from Harvard in 1998 proved to be quite popular with Korean policymakers. But for clusters to thrive, several conditions need to be met, and among them is the geographic concentration of linked services that includes government agencies to achieve critical mass, the incorporation of downstream channels to consumers, and reciprocation with educational institutions to leverage on human capital and create employment opportunities. So the first two are quite evident here within the hub itself. The third, meanwhile, extends into Suyong district across the river, which is not shown on the map here. And one of the gaps that was identified through BIF and its Asian Film Academy was a need to offer a film production program. Hence, the Busan Asian Film School was opened in 2016 with its own building in Suyong. 2 years later, CAFA, the Korean Academy of Fine Arts, which was established in Seoul in 1984, relocated to Busan to a new campus across the road from the Asian Film School. Now, this abrupt uprooting of CAFA from the capital has been criticized as being ill-considered, since the move severs a decades-long relationship with Chongmuro, the film industry district in Seoul. Now, in addition to the relocation of related government agencies, which are shown in the red text here, from the capital, the Busan Film Commission was established in 1999 by the Busan Metropolitan City and operates as a one-stop resource for filmmaking, offering rebates, location scouting, support, and post-production. And they do this through some of their facilities, which is the Busan Cinema Venture Center and Busan Post-Production Facility that's located in Samton City, and the Busan Cinema Studios. Through the city and film commission's effort, the film festival's reputation, of course, Busan earned its designation as the UNESCO Creative City of Film in 2014. However, to date, optimal performance of the cluster has yet to be achieved. So this could be because regeneration projects often focus on supply side deficiencies. And the front ending of energy and capital has not translated as smoothly into longer term outcomes. The Busan Film Commission has since extended its incubation period by another 5 years when it announced its Vision 2025 development plan earlier this year. Okay, so one of the key deliveries for the Innovation District was actually the Busan Cinema Center. The Busan International Film Festival's mid to long-term vision and development plan that was published in 2006 acknowledged the unstable hosting environment the BIF had to contend with for over a decade. So beyond providing a conducive hosting venue for the festival and concentrating its core functions under one literal and metaphorical roof, the authorities also recognize the long-term benefits of incubating a film industry hub with the cinema center as one of its anchor facilities. In 2010, a survey was conducted by the Busan Development Institute, which is a think tank for the city government, on over 2,000 BIF participants. The findings determined that the ripple effect of revenues that's generated, investment and employment opportunities arising from the film festival would be far-reaching for the city. And this success is due in part to the positive impact of its Asian film market. And this was something the report emphasized should be actively supported. So for the cinema center itself, it was unsurprising that the city government opted for a proven branding strategy that capitalized on the aesthetic appeal of iconic architecture. An international design competition was held in 2005, and the Vienna-based architecture practice, Kuphimerblau, which is headed by star architect Wolf Pritz, emerged victorious. So the cinema center was completed in 2011 to the cost of $150 million US. And this cost was mostly borne by the city. The cinema center was then inaugurated at the 16th BIF itself. And yeah, so in terms of like its architectural features, the topographical metaphors are used to infer Busan's natural terrain. And the main buildings that you have are like the Cine Mountain that you see on the left, that contains the cinematic, the theater, and 4 cinemas. And then on the right and further back is the Biff Hill, which houses the Biff's office and an outdoor theater resting on its slope. I specifically included this graph on the left-hand side to show what Busan's nascent film industry was up against at the time. So Busan constituted around 4% of the national share of the domestic film industry, while Seoul has 70%. Since screenings for the BIFF can't all be contained in the cinema center itself, the festival also taps into nearby venues for its program of 300 or so films. Within strolling distance are the multiplexes that are operated by Lotte in their Lotte department store above it, and the CGV, which is in the Shinsegae building. And these 2 particular multiplexes host the majority of this screening. Other partner venues in recent editions include Soyang Theatre, that's just a block away, and Megabox in Hyundai. With the completion of the cinema center in 2011, the concurrently run annual Asian Film Market likewise consolidated its 2 main events, which is the Asian Project Market and the Busan International Film Commission and Industry Showcase, or BIFCOM, which is co-organized with Busan Film Commission. And all this happens now in one location in Bexco, which is the Busan Exhibition and Convention Center. Now, in terms of the cinema center's design, the true complexity actually lies in the main roof's construction. It holds the distinction of being the longest cantilevered roof in the world. And this photo that is seen from across the Suyong River, you can see the horizontal profile of the hovering roof contrasts quite a lot with the density of the monolithic buildings that surround it. And come nightfall, the luminous complex becomes an animated architectural spectacle. It's modeled to simulate a rolling cloud. So the LED panels on the underside of the roof showcase these dynamic lighting patterns, transforming the architectural feature into a beacon for the new cultural hub, literally. Some of the design principles that was applied in the earlier cultural building projects by Huub Himmelblauw, such as the UFA Cinema Center in Dresden and the BMW Welt Museum in Munich, are resurrected here as well. What you see in the cinema center are the generous provision of public areas and spacious lobbies to free up the ground plan for open access. However, the social role of architecture does demand more than just a functional claim. Branding specialist Anna Klingman believes that for architecture to be appreciated, it must be able to build a relevant emotional experience at different points of contact with its users. And considering the BIFF status as one of Busan's premier events, the cinema center is teeming with visitors during the festival. The plaza comes alive with pop-ups and food stalls, with children that you see clamoring on the outdoor furniture and on the playful street installations. According to the architect, the basic concept of the project was a discourse about the overlapping of open and closed spaces and of public and private areas. For the diverse attendees of the film festival, the deceptive porosity of the cinema center belies various degrees of access. These are determined by the capacitor in which different groups consume the festival, from curious visitors to film ticket holders to badge holders to invited guests. And this is best illustrated when you see on the right-hand side by how the indoor and outdoor spaces in the cinema center are rezoned for the opening and closing ceremonies in order to manage separate access for the invited guests and the ticket holders. Now, film festival branding imbues a city with a distinctive film identity, and the festival organizers clearly understood the importance of extending the BIFF's reach by constructing a visible presence across the city. Place identities not only frame an enriched experience for festival goers, they speak to the power of place, by how place associations can be evoked by weaving explicit linkages across space and time. To understand the spatial attributes of the 3 official sites for the BIFF at an urban level, I've produced these figure ground maps of the cinema center, the BIFF square, and the BIFF village. So can you actually believe that these are all drawn at the same scale? This mapping technique is actually very effective for graphically revealing the relationship between built and unbuilt spaces in a visual format, and is often used to understand morphology, the patterns of built forms and urban density. So when you look at this, the unbuilt spaces that include streets and open areas are left as white. Buildings are in black, and built structures where the BIF events are hosted are in dark red. Just for clarity, I've also shaded the official extent of BIF Square, which is essentially several pedestrianized street segments. Okay. So considering how much vast open spaces there are in Centum City, and it's easy, and the cinema center's easy access from the metro station, the street legibility upon arriving on street level is actually quite poor. For first-time visitors, you have trouble finding this public path, which I've drawn in the red line, that's wedged between Shinsei and Lotte department store. So that's the one photo on the top, on the top, and which is actually the shortest and most direct route to the cinema center. By contrast, the much smaller block sizes in Nam Po Dong is a legacy of an old settlement that thrived here since the late 19th century. It served as a center of commerce throughout the 20th century and has experienced relentless densification and commercialization. Yet somehow it's managed to retain its core spatial identity. So along this archway line approach to the BIF Square from the metro station exit, visitors pass by sites of formerly independent cinemas that was utilized by the film festival in its earliest years, such as the rebuilt Busan Theatre on the right-hand side that began operating in 1937, but is now operated by Megabox. And when you're on BIF Square, in addition to the proliferation of food cart parasols that's emblazoned with the BIF logo, there are other more subtle and permanent branding interventions on street furniture, such as the cast bronze handprints of film honorees that's embedded in the pavement, the manhole covers and risers of subway staircases. Capitalizing on Nam Po Dong's heavy footfall of tourists and Busan residents year-round, a stage is actually erected in the BIF Square itself during the festival. So in addition to footages of previous BIF galas and live streaming of events from the cinema center, intermittent live music performances and guest appearances by Korean personalities are greeted often with enthusiasm by the crowd. This collective celebration of cinema is synchronously experienced in a transspatial format. Now, for the BIF village in Hyundai itself, each year, a creative commission design that uses various configurations of the shipping containers, which is a direct reference to Busan's status as an international port. It appears on there. And the public open talk sessions with film directors and actors and outdoor stage greetings by international celebrities have actually been held here since 2003. But it was only in 2005 when the BIF village was actually formalized. It's a short walk away from the Hyundai Grand Hotel, where lavish receptions and industry parties tied to the film festivals are held. And on the photo on the bottom right is an unassuming cluster of food stalls in the parking lot that's opposite the hotel, where important film contracts are known to be brokered. But because of its exposed location on the seafront, the BIF village is very susceptible to inclement weather. In 2013, 2018, and 2019, planned outdoor events were either cancelled or had to be moved to the cinema center in Centum City. And in 2016, a powerful typhoon actually destroyed the BIF village at the very start of the 21st BIF. Okay. So for some recent developments, ironically, the 2014 and 2015 editions of BIF, which recorded the highest attendances, also formed the most turbulent years for the festival and recent South Korean politics. BIF's programming independence was substantially challenged in 2014 when the then mayor of Busan, Soo Byung-soo, who was also on the festival's organizing committee, which is comprised of government officers and local business stakeholders, and he demanded that the documentary The Truth Shall Not Sink with Seoul, or Diving Bell in Korean, be removed from the BIF's roster because of the filmmaker's criticism of the authorities' handling of the ferry disaster and deficiencies in the government under Park Geun-hye. But the festival's organizers' refusal to acquiesce led to punitive actions by both city government and the state. In the aftermath, funding for the BIF was significantly reduced by 45% from the Korean Film Council for the festival's 20th anniversary in 2015, and by 60% from Busan Metropolitan City in 2016. Embezzlement charges were also brought up on the film festival director, Lee Yong-kwan, who was subsequently fired. His predecessor, Kim Dong-ho, had to return to see the 2016 edition through with quite a lot of competition, and it was due to the Busan One Festival. So the Busan One Festival was actually initiated by the Busan Tourism Organization. And the launch of this K-pop extravaganza in 2016 that clashed with the beef states was actually viewed by many as the city government's deliberate attempt to undermine the film festival. The lavishly produced One Asia Festival was broadcasted live and aggressively promoted overseas. This tactic was also not lost on One Asia staff themselves, who commented that it was highly illogical to hold two festivals of this scale concurrently in the city. A startling revelation that emerged during Park Geun-hye's impeachment trial was an official blacklist, which was also mentioned several times on earlier days in the conference. And this blacklist of cultural figures and of the film festival itself. This insidious database in excess of 9,000 names was purportedly used by the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism to exclude those listed from institutional support and access to funds. A sizable number of names included those who participated in a group declaration held outside the cinema center during the 19th BIF, demanding an independent investigation into the Seawall Ferry tragedy. A protracted boycott by industry professionals over the blacklist continued well into the 21st BIF that saw the lowest turnout for the festival in 2016 in over a decade. This chain of events, therefore, illustrates the synchronicity of several interrelated incidents in the space of the BIF itself. The next year proved to be a turning point for the film festival. Korea's new president, Moon Jae-in, a Busan native himself, gave his assurance that the autonomy of BIF would be respected. His attendance at the event was also the first by an incumbent president. This new chapter for the film festival should have seen its return to form, were it not for the global pandemic that began last year. So BIF Silver anniversary in 2020 was actually postponed by a fortnight and inevitably a scaled down affair. The film market events and forums, which are more widely attended by international audiences, were diverted online. But as festival chairperson Lee Yong-kwan resolutely stated, online screening isn't an option. So consequently, all films were screened only once at a reduced capacity at the cinema center alone. And the gesture demonstrates the organizers' commitment to the residents of Busan. And you can read it as a timely opportunity to reaffirm the BIF's pride as the homegrown festival for the city. So I think this is a good point to kind of end my presentation. So having moved base several times since its inception, the BIF's organizers have steadfastly maintained a classical setting as its film festival set up. So that is reliant on cinema, theaters, and large open-air screenings to induce a sense of shared experience. The conviviality and multi-site gatherings that have come to characterize BIF simply cannot be replicated online or other forms of mediation. As much as the physical spaces are crucial to the film festival's identity, dynamic tensions with the city continues to persist. Oh, and I purposely added this photo, which was taken just after 11 o'clock on the final night of the festival after the closing ceremony. So even though the BIF is an official event of the city, municipal requirements dictate that all street paraphernalia pertaining to the festival has to be dismantled by midnight of the final day. So, so they were like, all the municipal workers were going around like quickly dismantling them. Yeah, so that's my presentation for today. So thank you very much for attending from wherever you are on time zones. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. A virtual applause for you and for Andrew. We have a question from Ian, which I'd like to ask first. We can go a little bit late, I'm told. So let me ask his question. I have some questions too, but if anybody wants to pitch in, you can go to the Q&A button. So here's what Ian Dixon writes, and it's for Simon. Fascinating paper. Do you think there are metaphorical links between the multi-site of BIF and the... Oops, it just disappeared on me.
It's on the answered side.
I got it, yep. So I'll start again. Do you think there are metaphorical links between the multi-site of BIF and the spatial quality of films in Korea. That may sound crazy, but cinematic space and its relation to social forces is a fascinating topic, as you rightly point out in your analysis of space and socialization, taken up by filmmakers like Wong Kar-wai, Bertolucci, Cassavetes. Hope you can offer some insight on this. Having lived and worked in Seoul in 2000, I found the spaces fascinating from a cinematic perspective.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, actually, I have worked quite a bit on like cinematic analysis of urban spaces using film as as text in a way. Yeah. So I mean, what I've always found with the wonderful thing about cinema is that it's the ability to like weave like disparate sites into moving image medium. So again, it's this ability to sort of like create this narrative geography that exceeds the geographical space or even creative uses of it. So that's why I do think that there's actually, as you say, there is a very strong narrative as a city that's being applied to construct this festival experience. And again, but what was interesting for me with the study of the BIF itself was how it's actually been very thematic. So the sites are actually thematically named, right? And then it's like it actually pays on the spatial quality of the spaces already to sort of give it that sort of like that festival and identity. And again, it's just very conveniently appropriated. So the BIF village would be the containers of it. Again, it's referencing the port's identity. And of course, Nampodong, yeah. So I've actually written a lot more in the paper that I'm preparing for the book chapter for the South Korean film industry. And Nampodong, again, was actually a very important cultural and intellectual hub during the authoritarian regime. And this again happened during the mass exodus of refugees during the Korean War. There was a lot of creative descended into not just Nampodong, but also in Masan as well. Masan also another city in South Korea. And yeah, so again, there's this like long genealogy of like cultural identity that's been appropriated for the Nampodong site itself. But the other thing, again, now if I'm looking at film as text, the other thing I've actually always done quite a bit of is actually using the material contained within the film as sort of like spatial information. There's a lot you can excavate by looking at how like spaces are featured, how they're actually captured. So by actually capturing the spatial and even urban planning information is very interesting. So again, like how traffic has developed. Again, the socialization aspect is really important. How urban spaces create socialization, and again, how people actually play out their behavior in spaces of the city.
Can I pick up on that? The way you were talking about urban spaces kind of determine socialization and human interaction. I was really struck by this term you used, deploying the city.
Yeah.
And you know, around the time, well, before Hong Kong started losing steam, Tokyo International Film Festival rushed in and tried to become, you know, a competitor of Cannes and Venice and Berlin, essentially. And started in, I think it was 86 and went yearly in 1991. So it's tracking a little bit early, but here you have two large festivals with huge global ambitions. And one was incredibly successful and the other failed fairly spectacularly. And I'm wondering, as I listen to you, if it's because of the city. I mean, Tokyo is amazing, yeah, but I don't think the festival deployed the city.
No, I don't think it's so as well. So that was why I found BIF as a very interesting urban case study in that respect, is because of how the city government has actually effectively, well, okay, it's not just the city government, it was also the state itself as part of the entire national development plan, right?
Well, Tokyo was too, actually. Yeah.
Okay.
Essentially a government film festival.
But again, as you say, I don't think it's actually employed those different features of the spaces itself. So I mean, like if you look at it, the cinema center, the Centrum City or the cinema Center is basically part of a whole mega project. So that was actually the intention right from the start. But I mean, I lived in Tokyo. Yeah, I lived in Tokyo on off several years. But the thing with Tokyo is always been, it's a whole, it's like London, it's like a city of villages. It's very heterogeneous in that regard. And yeah, and Busan, as I've mentioned earlier on, it actually evolved from a single core city into the triple configuration, which is a fairly new thing. I mean, it only happened in after 2000.
I want to ask, there are a couple more questions, but for Simon, I want to ask Andrew a question. And I was struck the way that these critics were really using the language of film movements. But it doesn't seem like, despite what preceded it with the indies and the political films of like the 80s, they didn't seem to cohere or identify in that way. But their language about renovation of the, the tired body of Chongmoro, and the recognition of being recognized by the international other in order to measure one's success, really struck me. So I was curious, first of all, did they think of what was going on as a movement, a critical movement, or connected to the films? And second, why these three critics or scholars? How did you choose them? Because I know you were looking at a lot of other journals too. Are they camps?
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question, Marcus. Thanks very much. And let me answer the second question first, if I may, because that's the easiest one. And it wasn't really I was looking at these critics. It was more I was just researching Spring in My Hometown, and I came across these critics just through that research, because I was interested in what was the critical reception of Spring in My Hometown. Then I noticed that all these articles, they weren't really talking about Spring in My Hometown much at all. They were just using it as a way to get at Chungmuro, or a way to sort of speculate about what's going on. And these critics seem to have the clearest sort of vision of what they wanted from the future sort of South Korean industry, and that's why I chose these three. These articles are really interesting in that sense. They were talking about Spring My Hometown, but they also talk about something different. And then the first question you mentioned about whether they were film movements, whether they were sort of, that's a really good question. I don't really that's something I think I have to look into a bit more. But my impression is Kwak Yong-jin and people like these are quite engaged people, and these probably these were people who may have been sort of heavily involved in and student film movements in the Minjung, part of the Minjung movement and all the rest of it. And these were quite engaged people. But what's quite interesting, sorry.
I know that, like in the Japanese case, when you have critics who are writing in this mode, this particular mode that's really strong and muscular and critical, it's often they're representing a position overtly taken by the journals. Did you notice that? And this goes back, I mean, the French New Wave was like this, but actually in Japan, you can trace it certainly into the 20s or teens.
That's a really good question as well. I think I'll have to look a bit more into that. I think you're right. The writing style, I think Kino was well known for this writing style for being really opaque. And lots of people I interviewed as part art house managers, exhibitors, talked about, oh, we still reread, that was our Kino, that was our Cahiers de Cinema, and I still don't understand it. And I had the same problem trying to read these articles. I couldn't understand what they were talking about in Kino. The other ones were quite clear. And that they do adopt this sort of style, this sort of, but I think I'll look a bit more into what the policy of, or what the sort of whether they sort of took the kind of language and the position of the journal as well. Thanks very much. That's a really a good tip.
Okay, so here's another question for Simon from Julian Stringer. He says, thanks for 2 great papers. A question for Simon. There's a famous movie quote from Field of Dreams. Quote, if you build it, they will come, unquote. Is this true? I like that question. In other words, has Busan acted as a magnet for migrating talent from both inside and outside Korea, catalyzing startups, SEMs, etc., as well as professionals from industry support services like talent agencies and media lawyers? Thank you, from Julian.
That's a really good question, actually. So I have actually looked into that aspect as well. And yeah, so I have to look at it 2 ways. So is it true? Well, for Busan's case, not so much so, because the pool and the capital concentration in Seoul is it's just so extreme that it's really, really difficult for that to happen. So yeah, so that's why the Busan Film Commission has actually extended its vision the vision to 2025. So again, it's still an ongoing project. It hasn't escalated into the level of performance that it wanted to achieve. So there's also 2 things to it. So so that's the first thing. And the second thing is that rather than concentrating on Korea, because they know they cannot compete with Seoul, again, it's like in terms of film production and like the facilities and the concentration of talent and so on. So very quickly. Yeah, so what BFC has actually done is looking more towards Asia, towards more like the co-production aspect of it. And also in terms of, and also they're leveraging on a lot more on the UNESCO City of Film status as well as of 2 years ago. So what is done is, I think 2 years ago, they started this peripatetic film festival network with all the other UNESCO City of Film. So again, it's trying to create a niche for itself, because it, more towards like the Asian region, because it knows it cannot compete with Seoul. So in that regard, yeah, to a certain extent, it hasn't really worked out yet. But again, it's still work in progress. They're clearly trying.
Okay, so thank you very much. I want to thank Simone and Andrew. Thank everybody for coming. Thank for the NAM Center, Sangjoon, Nojin, everybody putting this together. The next panel is going to start at 8:20. Simone, there's a question for you. I hope you see it in the question and Q&A.
Yeah. I was so for the question,
look at that later.
Yeah, I'll answer them directly on the Q&A itself. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Hi, all the participants from the world. Welcome to panel 6 of the South Korean Film Industry Conference. And I suppose this is the last panel of this conference, and the panel is on transnational connections. I guess, you know, it's meant to be to actually end with this topic, transnational connections of South Korean cinema. And we have very exciting papers to be presented here today. Okay, our next presentation, which is a co-author piece by Sonia Dueñas from University Carlos III of Madrid. Forgive me for my non-existent Spanish. And
it's good.
Thank you. And she is now a PhD candidate, and she has a lot of very interesting experience in helping Korean media, Korean film to be disseminated in Europe. And her co-presenter, co-author for this paper is Luis Miguel Machín Martin from University de Laguna. And he too is a PhD candidate and an avid fan of East Asian film. He mentioned that he's also, besides Korean cinema, he's also interested in Japanese film, and he's currently working on Korean crime pictures. And so jointly, they will be talking about transnational film relationships between Europe and South Korea. And I am particularly intrigued by the two-pronged strategies that you mentioned, one going into East Asia by connecting Korean film industry with Hong Kong, Japan, China, and then the other direction going into Europe. So we'll be hearing their report on these two strategies. Okay, please, Sonia and Louis Miguel.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Emily Jue, for your introduction. So I would like to thank the Non-Center of University of Michigan for this event, and Professor Lee and the organization committee for the opportunity to present here this forthcoming book chapter. Of course, we don't want to forget to thank Evan and Kelsey for their work and help. Thank you so much. Well, we are very happy to be here, although it's a virtual event. Maybe we can meet in the future. Before starting the presentation, we have to say, well, it's a little bit later in Spain, so we have to say sorry if we commit errors in our English pronunciation, or maybe we cannot understand any question well. So first of all, we want to say sorry for that. Well, let's go with. Sorry?
No, I was just saying that you don't have to worry about it. We can hear you really well.
Thank you so much. So let's go with the presentation. As we can see, we're going to present here transnational film relationships between Europe and South Korea from 2005 and 2018. As we know, we are referring to co-productions. We will learn what co-production means and what it implies according to the agreement signed between Europe and South Korea. But first of all, we want to introduce this topic with the words that were written by Junhyoung. In his paper that you can see behind the text, we can observe three predictions about the evolution of South Korean film industry from 2008. First of all, the search for an improvement in the industrial structure, as we can see, especially in the last few years with, for example, the expansion through digital platforms like Netflix, although other issues still remain to be addressed. Secondly, the construction and promotion of a global cultural community against Hollywood, mainly in the Asian region. And finally, the promotion of co-production as a strategy to expand the local film market. Exactly, this is the key point of this presentation, the co-production. So this brings us to the agreement between Europe and South Korea signed in 2011. This agreement, which is ratified by the UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, was adopted in Paris on 20th October 2005 and was signed on 18th March 2007. So what are the principal objectives of this agreement? Well, first of all, as you can see, reinforcement, the co-production strategy, protection and promotion of both film industries, because both Europe and South Korea consider cinema as a cultural heritage, which needs the production from others. The protection from others. And of course, here we have two crucial points of this agreement. On the one hand, benefit from schemes from the promotion of local regional cultural content. On another hand, exchange of information on cultural and audiovisual matters. In other words, we need financial facilities we want to ensure that we enter both the European and Asian markets. And like you can see in the last point, we would like to exchange not only our professional workers, but also our knowledge. This is relevant, and we know you can remember that this was happened with the host by Bong Joon-ho and the exchange that occurred with the New Zealand and South Korean professionals. Therefore, in this case, we understand co-production like an audiovisual work produced by producers of both Korea and the easy party into which those producers have invested exclusively in accordance with the technical control of the Korea Film Council. And then we have, well, some requirements or instructions that these co-productions must comply. For example, the co-production agreement may be between one or several member states of Europe and Korea. How is the participation of these producers if the project is a fiction film or an animation film? And of course, how they must facilitate the contact between artists and professionals. As we can see, the exchange is important again. After this, we want to present to you the list of co-productions between Europe and South Korea from 2005 to 2018. Not all of them are registered around, not all of them are registered on the COFIC website. In fact, we have noticed that with respect to issues around co-production, there's a lack of outdated data. For this reason, we have also had to consult official European sources, such as Cine Europa, which is a platform financed by Creative Europe Media. Thanks to this website, we found 26 European and South Korean co-productions. As we can see, some of these films are already known to us, like The Berlin File, Snowpiercer, the works of Hong Sang-soo and Jero Jun, for example. Well, thanks to this list, we have begun to analyze each film from an industry point of view. So our goal is to see what elements they have in common and what differentiates them in order to learn more about the co-production strategy between Europe and South Korea. Now, Luis is going to present the first results we have obtained. We hope to expand little by little since this topic has provided us with a lot of information. So Luis, please.
Let's go. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Sonia. I apologize in advance. My English is a little bit rusted and here is very, very late. We are going to need a lot of coffee tomorrow, so I'm going to continue this presentation. In the first graphic, we can see the number of co-productions between Korea and Europe per year. As we can observe, there are not many clear trends in the number of co-productions through the years. So this shows how irregular this kind of productions have been. The only clear pattern is the absence of co-productions in 2010 and 2011, years in which the productions could have been affected by the financial crisis. The red line indicates when the co-production agreement between Korea and Europe was signed. In the second graphic, we have represented the European countries that have co-produced films with Korea more frequently. France is the most important country in this kind of co-productions with 17 films. So these are some of the main results of this study. As we saw in the previous slide, France is the principal co-production country in Europe. The Korean companies that appear more frequently in the sample are Yong and Junhyoung. These companies have a particularity. They were set up by Hong Sang-soo and Jeon Soo-il, respectively, and they serve to the purposes of those filmmakers. The European companies with more presence in the sample are Neon Productions and Sorba Productions, both French companies. We also found out that film festivals like Jeonju International Film Festival have funded some of the films of our sample. The directors who have used more times this co-production system are Hong Sang-soo, 4 films, Jero Jung, 3 films, Jun Soo-il, 2 films, San Lu, 2 films, and Ro Gyeon-tae, 2 films. There are also some auteurs that have financed their films in co-production between Europe and Korea. The aforementioned Hong Sang-soo, Bong Joon-ho, Brillante Mendoza, the great filmmaker from Philippines, or Penek Ranataruang from Thailand. We found out that the majority of the films in our sample are independent films, but there are still some exceptions. Those exceptions are Animal Crackers, an animated film, Snowpiercer, directed by Bong Joon-ho, The Berlin File, directed by Ryu Sung-wan, and Daisy, directed by Hong Kong filmmaker Andrew Lau. The most common genre in the sample is drama, a genre that we associate to independent cinema and auteur films. In 24 of the 26 total cases, we found out that the films circulated in the film festival circuit, and some of them in important festivals like Busan, Cannes, or Berlin. It's also significant the presence of Korean stars in those films, given that most of them are independent films. For example, Choi Min-sik plays the lead character in the film Himalaya Where the Wind Dwells. And we have identified actors from the Korean star system in 18 films of our sample. The main topics that appear in the analyzed films are related to mobility and North Korea. Those films that deploy a storyline with some kind of mobility in it often depict the Korean diaspora. For example, the film A Brand New Life, or show Korean characters as tourists in foreign countries. For example, the film A Korean in Paris. And sometimes the Korean diaspora is also related to North Korea, like in the case of the film Beautiful Days by Jero Jung. So after these results, we have some conclusions. First of all, we have identified the main objectives of Korean industry for this co-production system. The co-production with Europe guarantees the entry into the European market. Co-production also gives access to European A-category film festivals, especially Cannes, and receiving funding from official festival commissions and other institutions is the third objective. We also like to point out that this is an asymmetrical agreement between those two parties because the Korean party gets more benefits from this agreement. Also, there is a bigger artistic interest in Korea in this type of productions, and this is something that we can observe watching closely who are the directors of the films in the sample, because most of them are Korean. Finally, the last conclusion of this study is that this is a production formula used mostly by independent filmmakers working in low-budget films. That's all, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Sonia and Louis Miguel. A very interesting take on the co-production between South Korea and EU, and especially really appreciate that into the co-production treaty, and sort of compare that against the actual output from this agreement. Okay, so next paper, which is also our last presentation for this panel, I was just thinking, it's so interesting that the panel starts with South Korea's reaching out, or the transnational connection between Korean cinema and East Asia, particularly in China and Hong Kong. and then moving into EU, and now making a big circle across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States, into the very, very deep heart of New York City, the subway cinema. And so we have our last speaker, Goran Topolovich, a famous curator, writer, founder of Subway Cinema, to speak about the distribution, marketing of Korean film in, I guess, the most difficult market to penetrate as far as non-English language films are concerned. So he's going to talk about, from his topics, very interesting, you know, the two landmark films, from Junhyoung to Parasite, South Korean cinema's American story, distribution, marketing, and reception.
So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on your time zone. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel, and I would just like to thank Sangjoon and the rest of the organizing committee for inviting me. So the focus of my research is really to dig deeper into how distribution, marketing, and reception of Korean cinema in the American market has evolved over the past 2 decades, right? So, you know, it has certainly been a very long journey for South Korean cinema to establish itself in the minds of, you know, American cinephiles and wider audiences, as well as, you know, film critics and distributors, right? So it was a process, and you know, thanks to consistent efforts and work of various exhibition channels, including grassroots and genre film festivals, as well as kind of specialized and niche Asian and Asian American festivals, as well as you know, a new crop of Korean film festivals that started sprouting out. And of course, you know, the established film festivals and cultural organizations that also contributed to it. And of course, the evolving theatrical, home video, VOD, SVOD distribution models, right? And along with that goes all the media coverage in various consumer and trade, as well as fan publications, both print and online, and, you know, coverage in major newspapers. So, you know, the popularity of Korean cinema didn't really develop in a vacuum. And, you know, what kind of helped it in the long run is also the arrival of South Korea on the international stage as one of the, you know, global powers, you know, industrial powers and cultural powers. And, you know, the influx of, you know, consumer products and, you know, electronic devices and various elements of contemporary culture into the US, right? Anything from K-pop and food and TV dramas, and so all that kind of contributed to kind of change the image and perception of Korea in the mind of American audiences, right? So, you know, some of those challenges really from the standpoint of exhibition and introduction of South Korean films was really to overcome the kind of barrier that, and that, because, you know, if you ask an average American person like about Korea, you know, the first association was, hey, it's Korean War, or maybe it was the popular TV series MASH, right? And obviously those audiences who were kind of familiar with the Hong Kong, Chinese and Japanese cinema, South Korean films were kind of quite unique, right? So they weren't really comparable to the content that fans of, you know, those other national cinemas have been familiar with, right? And another challenge was, especially for the distributors who initially wanted to distribute Korean films, is that, well, you know, there's really no single genre or another marketing angle that they could be used to kind of easily promote South Korean films, right? So, you know, the case of Hong Kong movies, right, it was easy really with Kung Fu and martial arts genre, for example, right? So if we look at, you know, different types of audience segments that existed for Asian cinema in the United States in kind of mid to late 1990s, you know, that's just kind of before South Korean cinema started being introduced in the market in a kind of more steady and serious fashion, right? So you did have your big city kind of cinephiles and art house audiences, going to, since the foreign films in general, not just Asian films, were kind of delegated to the kind of specialty theatrical circuit, right? Anything with subtitles would go there. You had your fans of kind of devotees of Akira Kurosawa and Japanese samurai films. Then you had folks who were really into the kind of the martial arts and kung fu movies, and especially if they grew up in the 70s and 80s, and they kind of had those memories of being exposed to them in major urban centers, kind of grindhouse circuits. Then, of course, there was the Asian American community, and also the very vibrant Hong Kong cinema fan subculture, right, which kind of developed in the 90s and kind of grew around Chinatown movie theaters and video shops and Kim's Video in New York and so on. And then you had fans of Godzilla and Japanese kaiju movies and Ultraman and Tokusatsu. And then you had your anime fans. So you have all these disparate segments, right? So the challenge was always like how to bring Korean films, how to get people interested in Korean cinema, right? And I think there were various strategies that distributors have been employing, right? Some of them more successful than others, right? In terms of the kind of initial exposures, it was kind of interesting that in the late 1999, 2000, there was a really interesting program. It was a 14-film retrospective that was really presented by the Korean Cultural Service, New York, and it was hosted by East Asian Institute of Columbia University. And it really provided a kind of excellent overview of a history of Korean cinema, going all the way from after the Korean War to I think the most latest film was Contact, right? But it did cover a number of films from Korean New Wave and kind of other classics, kind of from the 60s, The Stray Bullet. But this was a kind of more focused on, in the kind of more academic circle, so it didn't really get much attention outside of that space. But it was certainly a worthy event. And then, obviously, like Shiri was kind of one of those first films of the new Korean cinema that was getting attention. And Asian American International Film Festival, which is run by Asian Cinevision, and at the time it was the longest running Asian and Asian American film event in the United States, and probably North America. So they were actually the first ones to screen Shiri, but once again, because it was kind of more directed toward a niche audience, an Asian American community, it didn't really get that much attention, that screening itself outside. But what really created some waves and excitement was Nowhere to Hide, right? So it was at Sundance in 2000, new directors, new films, and so on. So there was like so much excitement, and people were saying, well, it's next John Woo, and of course, director Lee then also was in the States, and he was trying to see if he can make a movie in Hollywood, right, at the time. Kind of in 2001, kind of new directors, new films also kind of continued their, to include some of the new Korean films in their lineup. So obviously Peppermint Candy, and then it was interesting inclusion of The Foul King, right? Not exactly your typical kind of art house or kind of film society type of film. And of course that year also the Isle at the Sundance Film Festival. So just to let you know, so what I'm presenting here right now is I'm just kind of using very broad brush strokes, right, to kind of touch upon some of the important events over the past 2 decades. It is by no means an exhaustive study yet, right, because it's still researching, and it's about it's a little bit New York City centric and biased, because obviously that's kind of based on my experience, so that's the starting point. And of course things that happen in New York are kind of important, with New York being the media center in the United States, so they tend to get kind of more attention, right? All right, moving right along. So then in 2001, it was the very first New York Korean Film Festival at the Anthology Film Archives, and presented, by Subway Cinema, kind of grassroots organization that, was part of, and also by Korean Film Forum, which was a group of Korean film students from NYU and Columbia. And I actually wanted to give a shout out to No Kwang-woo, one of the panelists, who was actually part of that original team that organized the New Korean Film Festival, and we call it When Korean Cinema Attacks, right? So there was a, really the whole idea is to bring more attention to white American audiences, right, to these films, and outside of just kind of the art house circuit, but just, genre fans and, folks who were into Hong Kong movies and so on. And we were actually fortunate to be able to have directors Kim Ji-won and Junhyoung at the time as guests. That's just an example of a newspaper advertisement. It was really trying to get attention. Here's an antidote for the summer of Hollywood swill we had to endure. So, the whole point was that this, as actually Brian, another one of members of Subway Cinema team and organizers, right? So he really summarized it well, right? So essentially at a festival, the common themes that he has heard from people after coming out of screenings was they really liked the films, and two, the films were like nothing that was coming out of Hollywood, right? So it was kind of very refreshing for American audiences, and a lot of them were really surprised, like, my God, I had no idea Korea was making these kinds of films, right? So it was really a sense of discovery and excitement, right? And also folks were really surprised by the sheer variety of films that were on display, right? So they were also kind of different from one another. And there was a lot of good reception in the press. You can see the New Yorker actually had a cartoon commission for JSA, and it was coverage in New York Post, New York Magazine, Time Out New York, and so on. For obvious reasons, a lot of them focused on the aisle. That caused a lot of controversy, obviously, and then we see a bit more coverage in specialized film publications such as Movie Maker and Film Quarterly. And then, 2002, 2003, the Korean Film Festival is kind of evolving and continues to run, right? So they're increasing the number of films. And then Subway Cinema launches the New York Asian Film Festival, which in 2002 launches with only three films, but in 2003 kind of increases it to 7. They were able to show Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, and My Sassy Girl actually won the audience award, right? And this was still kind of very grassroots, kind of cinephile, genre fan type of festival. And kind of if we look at the distribution patterns at the time, like from 1999 through 2003, even though there was a lot of excitement around Korean cinema at the film festivals and other specialized events, that didn't necessarily translate into success at the box office, right, in the specialized market, right? So Junhyoung was kind of really the most successful, right, at the time, right? It kind of being at the Cannes Film Festival and New York Film Festival, and kind of following that your typical art house kind of model, the type of film, kind of lush costume drama, and so a bit exotic, right? But a lot of the other films, it was kind of challenging for distributor. A lot of them also kind of independent distributors, and didn't have a lot of marketing muscle to really promote these films, and they had to rely on press and word of mouth. I mean, even though the critical response was positive, it was really challenging to get the audience for all those reasons that we previously mentioned, kind of lack of familiarity with Korean cinema. They didn't know who these, actors are and actresses, and, so IDP distribution, they made an attempt to release Shiri, right? But it didn't do very well. And they were also kind of at a loss how best to sell it. So, they had to resort to, hey, girl with a gun, but didn't work so well. All right, and then really big event in 2004 at the Film Society of Lincoln Center. That Richard Pena put together this amazing 40 film retrospective, right, of Korean cinema. I don't think they've ever done such an encompassing retrospective of any national cinema. I don't really remember. It was just quite amazing at the time, like 40 films, and it was a wonderful introduction. So they also followed that with the special focus in Korean cinema in their film comment issue, November December 2004. New York Korean Film Festival continues, right, with their programs, as well as New York Asian Film Festival. And the big movie was obviously Old Boy, right? Once Park Chan-wook got his Grand Prix at Cannes. Tartan Films, which was a UK-based distributor, they also launched their branch in United States, right? So Tartan Films USA was founded, and they got the rights for Old Boy, and they brought it to the theaters. Lots of press coverage, lots of excitement, obviously. Box office was decent, right? But it didn't really break that 1 million, right? So the widest release they had was about 28 theaters. And in the United States at the time, like at a specialty market, our house circuit, like you feel like you're successful if you're maybe break that 1 million. But it was close. But certainly they also made money on the subsequent video release. Now, what this showed us is like that, this had a more of a cult audience appeal. Didn't really cross over that much to the more mainstream audience. But people who liked the movie really liked it. So Tartan really focused. They created this new label, Tartan Asia Extreme, and they released quite a few Korean and other Asian films in home video, right? So, but their kind of main titles were really the Vengeance trilogy, right? Which is kind of interesting, kind of just the snapshot from the New York Magazine, where Old Boy is somewhere between, it's in this corner of really lowbrow and brilliant, right? So going back to the box office figures from theatrical releases, 2004 to 2006 timeframe, right? So some of the bigger distributors get into the game, and obviously they're able to put a bit more into the marketing, so which really worked for Sony Pictures Classics, right, with Kim Ki-duk Spring, Summer, Fall, Winter, and Spring, 2.4 million roughly, and also IDP distribution. They kind of really focused on Taegukki, Kang Ji-kyu's Taegukki, and it was also Korea's entry for the best foreign language film, so they did well there. So Sympathy for Lady Vengeance didn't do as good, nor did Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance when it was released theatrically. And Save the Green Planet and Memories of Murder, which now are one of the top movies, right? If you ask any fan of Korean cinema or any critic, really, also did kind of poorly. So more distributors enter the market, but they break that 1 million barrier, but there's still a lot to do, right, to introduce Korean cinema into. So 2007, another landmark year, is really the year that starts this relationship, kind of direct-to-distributor collaboration between Bong Joon-ho and Tom Quinn. So Tom Quinn was at Magnolia Pictures, and he was kind of responsible for the Host being brought to the United States, and having that push behind. And what he realized at the time is, he really loved Bong Joon-ho as a filmmaker, and he thought he was right to say that, well, maybe the easiest way to market Korean films is really to focus on directors, right, and to build them up as director brands, as these genre tours, right. And it was kind of a long journey, and Tom Quinn has worked with Bong Joon-ho and has been involved with distributing, all of his subsequent films since the Host, right? So he was first in Magnolia, then he was Radius TWC, which was kind of specialized genre label, Weinstein Company, and then finally with Neon and their success with The Parasite, right? So, but it was really some really good coverage. Did really well at the box office. It was probably the widest release of the Korean film at the time, 116 theaters. So, and it was kind of easier to say, hey, it's a monster movie. Who doesn't like monster movies? And it's a thinking person's monster movie. Even get a nice cover in Art Forum magazine. So it's even kind of reaching that kind of art audience, right? How are we on time?
Minutes maybe, because we're supposed to open up the Q&A floor at 9:20.
At 9:20. Oh.
yeah, but it's okay. Just try to wrap up as quickly as you can. Thank you.
All right, so we have a bit of an anomaly here with the Dragon Wars, which just kind of came out of nowhere, and had this ridiculously wide release, and that's a whole. I mean, D-War itself is almost like deserves like a research. Should be like a paper just on D-War. What was going on there? I'll skip on that. A lot of other stuff happening. It just more and more festivals are introducing other filmmakers and doing other retrospectives. It's really kind of reaching popular consciousness. It was kind of interesting that Entertainment Weekly magazine, right? So Samuel Jackson picked Old Boy and Duelist among his top 10 new classic Asian films. Tartan unfortunately shuts down in 2008 because they had some financial troubles, I think, at the parent company in UK. So, Drama Fever is founded, specializing in streaming Korean dramas. There's Kim Ki-doo retrospective at MoMA, Kim Ki-young retrospective at Film Society. A New Asian Film Festival brings Kong Yoo-jin and Soji Sub. A New Korean Film Festival had Unsung retrospective. Lee Byung-hun stars as Storm Shadow in G.I. Joe: The Rise of Cobra, and very importantly, CG Entertainment decides to start direct distribution. 2013, big year for Korean filmmakers and actors in Hollywood, because 3 Hollywood movies directed by Korean directors: Park Chan-wook, Kim Ji-yoon, Bong Joon-ho, and obviously Byung-hun is in sequel to G.I. Joe and Red 2. New York Asian Film Festival kind of goes crazy with how many Korean films they're showing and inviting guest directors, and stars. A lot of excitement there, including, of course, Jae-min-sik. So direct distribution, and CJ opens their CGV cinema in LA. Welgo USA enters the market. So you could see the box office is just going up now. That's 2019 is a huge year for Parasite, obviously, and so it's kind of interesting that the success of Parasite and really introduces direct-to-Wong and Korean cinema as a whole to a whole new audience, right? And so there's enormous interest. So there was another kind of retrospective of new Korean cinema at the Film Society in 2019, which was extremely well received. A lot of young people in the audience, incredibly enthusiastic. And we also find out that there's a new generation of American filmmakers who has kind of grown up being influenced by Korean films, right? So case in point, Ari Aster, director of Midsommar and Hereditary, he loves, for example, Save the Green Planet, right? So he was there to introduce the screening of Save the Green Planet. And as I'm sure you guys know, his production company is also, working on the English language remake that Jung Joon-han will actually direct, right? So 2020, pictures say everything, right? So after 12 years of branding Bong, the fruits of Bong Tom Quinn collaborations are there, right, for everyone to see. And even the criterion barrier was kind of broken, in which there was only one a movie, Secret Sunshine, in 2011, and the classic Housemaid was part of the Martin Scorsese World Cinema Project. But now with Bong's win, Parasite comes out of Criterion. Memories of Murder is up next this year, and probably more Korean titles to come. And so I think that kind of completes the presentation. I know I just kind of touched, but I just kind of wanted to give you like a very high level quick view of how things have changed for Korean cinema in the United States. So I will stop now. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Goran, and for a very detailed and very complete documentation and illustration, and also your own analysis on the way that Korean cinema evolved, emerged, from, especially as far as New York City is concerned, from like a neighborhood.
You're welcome.
Yeah, national cinema all the way into a very important part of the global cinema, and especially its global influence. Okay, now we are going to, well, our panel, I think originally was supposed to end on 9:30, and now we actually have the extension until 9:40. So I guess, you know, we have 10 minutes or maybe a little bit more than 10 minutes for questions, Q&A. Okay, let me see.
Actually, the Q&A can go until 9:50 or even 10. This is last panel, so take your time.
Okay. Do I get OT compensation? All right. Okay. Sorry. Yes. Questions, please. We actually have 3 questions posted on the our chat box, so I will read those first, and I think we also have a couple of questions now coming in from our online participants. Okay, so the first question is from Junhyoung. It's going real fast. Let me go back. From Junhyoung Cho. This is a question for Sonia and Louis Miguel. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. My question is, I quote, "It seems that the number of co-production films did not increase significantly even after the co-production agreement between Korea and the EU. What do you think is the reason?"
I think this agreement is still consolidating, and it's the first step in both directions. But as Europe is not the principal market of interest for Korea, this is going really slow.
Sonia,
Yes. Oh, sorry. No, it's if you remember the list of films, most of them are focused on participating in category A festivals. And of course, these festivals are focused on independent and author films. So it's difficult to promote this kind of projects.
Right, yeah. Okay, thank you. And another question for Sonia and Louis Miguel. This is from No Kwan Wu. Okay, this question is this: is there any European filmmaking project with Korea now? I remember Luc Besson made Lucy with Korean actors, including Cho Min-sik and staffs before.
Well, I don't know.
This time,
sorry.
Okay. At this time, we have no news of any new projects between Europe and Korea. We have really focused exclusively between 2005 and 2018, precisely because of the limited information we have regarding current projects. However, it is possible that the COVID pandemic will worsen the situation and reduce the number of agreements.
Louis Miguel, you have something, anything else to add?
Nothing more. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Now, there's a question for Goran. This is from Hugh Seong Chung. This is, okay. Goran, could you explain the reception of Parasite in New York City? I was very interested in how audiences were taken by that film. So much in our local art house in Fort Collins, Colorado. Oh, this is Connecticut, I don't know. At the theater show Korean films before, but no other films got this kind of reception. I saw Snowpiercer in the Denver art house, but noticed people were disappointed. How did people react to Parasite in New York City? Why do you think this particular Bong Joon-ho film crossed over that big time?
So I think it's a combination of several factors, right? So actually, speaking of Snowpiercer, I think a lot of the long-term Bong Joon-ho fans were also disappointed with that movie, right? So, but the thing is that Tom Quinn has been building Bong Joon-ho brand for a while, right? So you already had a fan base, people who were supporters of Bong Joon-ho and his work, right? That's there. And then you also have a big marketing muscle. A lot of money was put into promoting Parasite, and also from CJ Entertainment, right? A lot of people in New York, they go to see a movie if the New York Times does a positive write-up, right? So, and there was a lot of coverage in the New York Times about Bong Joon-ho and Parasite and so on, right? But obviously that's not enough, right? Okay, you can get people to the movie theater, but it's got to be a great film. And Parasite really fit what really struck a chord with the audiences at the time, right? So it is a film for our times based on its subject matter, and I think it also appealed a lot to younger audiences as well. So you have kind of all those elements coming together, and just observation, right? And there was a lot of positive feedback, a lot of also word of mouth, because those people who have seen it and loved it, maybe they didn't even know about Bong Joon-ho before, but it's like, oh my God, they're telling their friends, you got to see this movie, right? And then it starts opening wider and wider, and so all those factors contributed to it. So I would say, yeah.
It's very similar to the success of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon back in 2000. Yeah, it's very, very similar. Okay,
Yeah,
another question, for Goran again. This is from Maggie Lee. Hi, Goran, long time.
Oh.
Great presentation. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I read articles about Parasite by US writers, including Oscar campaign editorials, and often they call it independent film, quote unquote. And producer Mickey Lee, as a producer who dared to take risk on this indie project. What do you think is the reason? Do you think that this is a part of a strategy of the campaign?
It could have been, but to call this an indie film, it's it's just like in the same way in which Lucas considers himself independent filmmaker, right? So I mean, there were a lot of resources behind this film, right? So there was a lot of money, a lot of muscle, a lot of but yes, indie maybe in the context of Hollywood establishment, or perhaps, hey, this is a foreign language film. Maybe they try to kind of position it in a way in which it would kind of appeal to certain elements of the press and elements of the voters for the awards. Perhaps, I don't know. I mean, I'm not intimately familiar with the details of their marketing strategy and plan, but I wouldn't be surprised that it was one of the reasons kind of to position it in that regard, right?
Okay, we have.
But great to hear from Maggie. So yeah, we just to let you guys know, if someone is trying to send me a direct chat, for whatever reason my chat is disabled, I cannot respond to you. But I'm not ignoring you. I'm not able to respond to you guys. So just get in touch with Sangjoon if you want to contact me, and he can give you my email address. Thank you.
Okay, great, gotcha. All right, so we have 3 questions posted on the Q&A box. First one is from Dr. Naibe Bermuda. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. So this is a question for Louis, Miguel, and Sonia. Has Spain participated in co-production schemes with South Korean, and if so, which are those?
Spain participated in the production of the film Animal Crackers. The way Spain participated in this film was basically adding a lot of animation crew, public funding from institutions like the Tenerife Film Commission.
Yes, and there was also a failed project in 2005 that was never released, and we never heard anything about anything more about it. And well, outside the co-production strategy, we can also find private participations, such as the animated film Red Shoes and Seven Dwarfs in 2019 by Hong Sang-ho. But it's private participation, is not a co-production. So, well, Spain is not the principal market in Europe.
Okay, 2 more questions here. This one, second one, comes from Michelle Cho. Okay, thanks for this great panel. Just addition, these regional portraits of Korean films, transnational exchanges is very helpful. I have a question for Goran. Your overview shows us two main audiences / marketing strategies for Korean national cinema over time. A, art house / cinephile fare. B, quote unquote, lowbrow genre / cow cinemas. Did you observe a convergence of these two audience groups or two spaces more broadly during the 2000s? How was that reflected in other areas of New York film culture? It's a very good question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. But I guess what we have seen, not just in New York film culture, but also wider, is in a way, I don't know, maybe it's a simplification, but the grindhouse has become art house, right? So there has been this kind of a respectability has been given to genre films by many traditional film festivals and cultural institutions, right? So you're going to see, the perspectives of traditionally genre filmmakers and, discoveries of their work and focus on their work, right? So definitely there's a convergence and things that kind of changed in which even the art house and let's say the cultural gatekeepers are looking at cinema. And I think a lot of it also has to do with the audiences, right? With the new generations of audiences coming into the play and being interested in those films and taking those films seriously, right? Which then kind of maybe it's kind of chicken and the egg kind of thing, but then the institutions are also responding to that interest, and they know now that it can attract the audiences, but also realizing that these films are also worth of their attention and analysis and like that, right? So. Because another example was if you look at the Hong Kong cinema, right, it was also kind of really subculture. Hong Kong genre films, nobody cared about them, but now it's like Johnny To and Choi Hark, they're really almost like our house now, right, in a way. But you know what I mean? They're given a serious treatment and respect, right, which they wouldn't have gotten in the past, right, in the past like 20 years ago. So yeah.
Great. Another question for you, Goran. This is from Irene Lee. Thank you for great presentations. I think this is for all the panelists. Okay, I have a question to Goran regarding the branding of Bong. So as a marketing strategy, Bong Joon-ho, could you please relate the trend to other Korean filmmakers or national cinemas in American market?
So I think similar attempts have been made to brand Korean filmmakers, right? Obviously, Park Chan-wook was sort of the first one, and also Kim Ji-won as well, right? But obviously, the success of branding Bong has kind of surpassed both Park Chan-wook and Kim Ji-won, right? So why Bong has worked so well? Well, what's the formula, right? It's these things are unpredictable, right? There's no guarantee, right? Everybody kind of tries to do the best they can to get these movies to the audiences and to get people interested. But that's why it's film business. It's kind of interesting. You never know what's going to happen, right? There are no guaranteed successes. So, but yeah, so I think you had a number of distributors who had kind of looked the best ways, like, okay, well, let's focus on brand directors and auteurs. And of course, Park Chan-wook kind of being the first one, winning Cannes, and then Tartan's like, okay, we're going to have this trilogy and Vengeance trilogy, and maybe it's possible that Bong's films have more wider audience appeal that Park Chan-wook's do, right? Maybe that's also one of the reasons, right? And but certainly I'm not as familiar with how other filmmakers outside of Asia cinema have been kind of marketed or branded, because my focus has been more on kind of East Asian cinema, really. But so I can't really speak to that. But I think some of the other, let's say, European cinemas already have some tradition and reputation, and a lot of the established film festivals in the United States have kind of started around European cinema, right? So there's already, they don't really need to necessarily do branding around the filmmaker so much, perhaps, to get attention and to get the audiences. like French cinema or things of that nature. So, but yeah, just my view. But thank you for a great question.
It's very interesting because Korean television dramas are hugely popular in China and in Southeast Asia, and it would be difficult to imagine whether Korean television would actually receive the kind of receptions like Korean cinema do in the USA market or even in Europe.
Right. I mean, there's a fan base in the U.S. for Korean dramas, but there's not a whole lot of crossover between audience for Korean dramas and for Korean cinema so much, right? The only crossover that we've noticed over the years at the Occasional Film Festival, if you have a popular Korean TV drama star in a movie, all the fans are going to show up, and that's the only movie they're going to watch. They're not going to care about anything else, right?
So I have a question for Nikki and Sonia and also Miguel regarding reception. So I was wondering, since Korean actually opened up the can of reception from distribution and marketing to the reception of Korean cinema in the United States. Like I said, this is the most difficult market to get in for any non-English speaking foreign films. And so what about the reception of Korean film or, any other Korean audiovisual products in UK and EU? I tend to think that these are two different markets.
It's an interesting question. Korean films work very well in France because they are promoted thanks to the Cannes Film Festival. And it is precisely the best market for Korean films at the moment. In fact, the rest of European industries attend this festival to agree on the distribution of certain Korean films in the rest of Europe. Well, in the case of Spain, we depend a lot on the program of the San Sebastian and Sitges festivals, which usually bring a very good program of Korean films. Thanks to them, we can see these movies in theaters. This is the reality.
I think in Europe, films that were more acclaimed were outer films, especially those directed by Kim Ki-duk or Hong Sang-soo. But I think that has changed slowly, and now I think the European audiences are more receptive to big budget films. This is something that is being promoted by the streaming platforms, and streaming platforms is changing a lot for our audiences in Europe.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have a really good panel today. Very engaging presentation and discussion. And I would like to thank Sonia, Louis, Miguel, and Goren, and also all the participants all around the world. And I'm Emily Ye. So I guess Sangjoon just show up in his space. So I guess he's ready to take over. Sangjoon, over to you.
So yeah, thank you so much. This is really fantastic panel. Yes, I really enjoyed, so I didn't want to stop it. I wish I could, give you guys talk more and discuss more about the issues. But really, we really have to wrap up now. It's almost 10. So thank you so much for your participation. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Goran. Thank you, Luis, Miguel, and Sonia, and thank you, Nikki. Especially for those who are, joining us from Europe, in Spain and then UK. It must be, 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. So thank you so much for your participation. I hear your pains. So yes, so I hope you have a good night's sleep. Okay, thank you, Goran, and thank you, Emily. So yes, so I will wrap up today's panel. Today's actually, this is the last academic panel of this conference, and tomorrow we'll have director spotlight with Bora Kim. So Maggie Lee, variety film critic, and Bora, along with Eung-san Kim of University of Michigan professor. So three of them will talk about Bora Games, House of Hummingbird, and other issues, right? So tomorrow is the really the end of this 5-day the South Korean film industry conference. So don't please come back tomorrow. We have very interesting discussion will be happening tomorrow. Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye.